Well, hello again, and welcome to the fifth of our lectures on the foundations of Western civilization. The last time we talked in particular about the Hebrews. Today we're going to turn to a succession of great empires. In particular, and in the first place, the Assyrians, who conquered the Hebrew kingdom of Israel, then to the Neo-Babylonians, who conquered the kingdom of Judah, and then we'll move on through a number of smaller imperial states to a consideration of the Persian Empire. In a certain sense, the theme of this lecture, the central point that we'll be tracking, is the building of larger and larger and larger states on the land of Mesopotamia, on the land of the Middle East, the land with which we began in Sumer in our second lecture. Now, the period of Phoenician and Hebrew independence then, and you'll recall perhaps my saying that this independence emerged because there was a kind of a gap between great imperial states. The Egyptians and Hittites had worn themselves out. The Assyrians had not quite come on the scene yet. But this period of independence for people like the Phoenicians and the Hebrews was brought to an abrupt end by the Assyrians, who built a very large empire indeed, the largest that had been built up until that time. Now, the Assyrians were a Semitic-speaking people who had been important in northern Mesopotamia in the second millennium BC. They then declined for a period of years, and then after about 900 BC, from their capital at Nineveh, they began a lightning series of military campaigns that created an empire stretching really from the boundaries of Persia, Iran to us, over to, and indeed, including the north of Egypt. Now, I've several times mentioned Semitic-speaking peoples. For example, I mentioned the Hyksos, and now I've mentioned this in connection with the Assyrians. And of course, also, the Hebrews spoke a Semitic language. It's important perhaps just to say here, so that in later lectures we can refer to it, that scholars now divide people historically around the globe by language groups. No longer do we try to divide them by races, no longer do we try to divide them by ethnicity. These are modern and constructed categories. They're not biological, they're not in the blood. You can't take somebody's blood and say, oh, that person speaks a Semitic language, or that person is Irish, or that person is something else. So we divide people up more or less neutrally by languages. So we're dealing now with another of the Semitic peoples. You'll recall perhaps my mentioning the Hittites were the first Indo-European speakers whom we encountered. We'll encounter many more of those as we go along. Now, back to our friends the Assyrians. They built this enormous imperial state largely on the basis of a very large army, the use of iron weapons, and the use of cavalry. Now, a large army is not so remarkable in and of itself. The use of iron weapons is important. Previously, we have been working through what we might call the Bronze Age, and the weapons were bronze. The Assyrians, with their iron weapons, simply had a higher grade of military technology than the peoples whom they encountered. Cavalry, for the Assyrians, was basically a tool of getting to the battlefield quickly. They didn't really understand the use of cavalry on the battlefield. The Persians, as we'll see in a few minutes, were the ones who discovered how to use cavalry on the battlefield. But the Assyrians were able to get there fast. And that was really what they learned from the use of horses. Now, in 722 BC, as we saw in our last lecture, they conquered the kingdom of Israel, and they deported its inhabitants, the 10 lost tribes, beginning the period of the exile. Now, the Assyrians were, as I hinted in the lecture on the Hebrews, bad guys. Their basic policies were cruel. Their basic policy was state terrorism. They routinely rounded up and killed large numbers of people just by way of sending a message to everybody else that they could do that to them too at any time and for no reason. Even their art glorified fear and destruction. If you've ever seen, for example, any of the great Assyrian stone carvings, there are some in museums in this country, in the Metropolitan in New York, but there are particularly large and fierce ones in the British Museum in London, if you've ever been in the room there of antiquities. To walk by one of these panels is actually to feel eerie, to feel scared. That's exactly what they meant to evoke in you: fear, terror. Well, not surprisingly, the Assyrians didn't evoke much loyalty. They didn't evoke much affection. And what they did evoke was a challenge. Now, this challenge arose from a coalition of peoples who very often were seen as liberators, you see, as liberators from the Assyrians. They didn't necessarily want to be conquered by these new guys, but they really wanted out from under the thumb of the Assyrians. Now, in this great coalition of people, one key group were the Neo-Babylonians. Now, you'll remember we talked of the old Babylonians. That's the people of Hammurabi, he of the great law code. The Neo-Babylonians are the people whose most famous king was Nebuchadnezzar, who turns up in some of the later books of the Hebrew Bible. He reigned from about 605 to about 562 BC. Now, he built a very large realm based in Mesopotamia, based in the same areas where the Assyrians had been. Their capital now is at Babylon and not at Nineveh, but the point is that the center of this realm is basically in the same place that the center of the Assyrian realm had been based. Now, the main achievement of the Neo-Babylonians, whose high point lasted only about a century, they were not really on the scene very long, was the massive rebuilding of the city of Babylon, creating there the famous Hanging Gardens, one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, an elaborate palace complex with beautiful pleasure gardens surrounding it. So then the Neo-Babylonians were one of the peoples in the great coalition that brought down the Assyrians. There were also a number of minor players at this time. For example, up in central Anatolia, people called the Lydians. Now, the Lydians might very well have disappeared from history. They weren't particularly remarkable, were it not for two things. One, they invented coinage. As far as we can tell, they invented coinage. And eventually, of course, virtually everyone who came after them used coined money. Did they always borrow it from the Lydians? Well, it may very well be, as we'll see in a minute, that they borrowed it from the Persians, who borrowed it from the Lydians, who disseminated it a great deal further. But the point is, the Lydians invent coinage. The second thing is their legendary king Croesus. Now, his wealth was legendary, probably because he heaped up coins, because he collected a large number of these coins as taxes and tribute. His very name meant wealth in the ancient world. We still say somebody's rich as Croesus, or maybe some of us say things like that. So, Croesus is famous, and the Lydians made money, but they also walked their weary hour on the stage and departed. Not really much to be heard from afterwards. Not so the other great party to the anti-Assyrian coalition. These were the Medes and the Persians. Now, these were peoples who had been living, the Medes in the Zagros Mountains, the mountain range basically that divides Iran from Iraq. They'd been living in those mountains for a very long time, and we haven't heard much about them. And indeed, their people in antiquity hadn't heard much about them. The Persians, on the other hand, lived down on the Iranian plain. And they had been there for a very long time, but again, had not been particularly interested in the lands to their west, in Mesopotamia. Eventually, and we can say actually of the Medes and the Persians that they're ethnically related. They speak a similar language. They're roughly the same kinds of people, but there are some differences among them. In any case, they began to forge a great unity. And under the great King Cyrus was the Shah. He was the Shah-in-Shah, the king of kings. Founded a monastery, good heavens, founded a monarchy which ceased in 1979, when the Shah of Iran was put off his throne, the oldest reigning imperial regime in the world. Well, in any case, Cyrus, the Shah-in-Shah, forged this great unity between the Medes and the Persians, and formed a temporary alliance with the Neo-Babylonians that had as its first goal, as its first aim, sort of putting an end to the Assyrian menace. In a certain sense here, this was probably, we may say, from the standpoint of the Medes and the Persians, a preemptive strike. The Assyrians had not conquered Persia, but there was always the great fear that they might do so. So in a sense, the Medes and the Persians finally say, it's in our interest to get rid of these guys. And that's basically what happened then to the Assyrians. Now, very quickly, the Persians, who were at a much higher level culturally, who were at a much higher level economically, who had much more sophisticated political organization, became the dominant partner in the Mede-Persian fusion. Now, the Medes and Persians, or as we'll call them from now on, the Persians, then began themselves a series of lightning military campaigns. These campaigns went east, virtually to the frontiers of China. These campaigns went southeast, virtually to the frontiers of India. And these campaigns went west. They went to the Mediterranean Sea, overrunning the eastern shore of the Mediterranean. They went to the west into Egypt and overran Egypt and small portions of the coast of North Africa, even to the west of Egypt. And they conquered virtually all of Anatolia, all of what we would think of as Turkey, including its Mediterranean coastland, where, I'll just mention, large numbers of Greeks lived. In a later lecture, we're going to bump into these Persians as the Persians and the Greeks were bumping into each other. But the point for now is simply to say that the Persians built, in a series of remarkably fast campaigns, the biggest empire that had ever been built anywhere up until that time, and indeed one of the largest, really, that has ever been built. How did they do it? Well, there's a number of reasons, I think, for the Persian success. Again, like the Assyrians, they had a very large army. The Persian army, we think from later reports, may have numbered on a regular basis as many as 300,000 men. Now, the Greek historian Herodotus tells us when the Persians invaded Greece that they had an army of 1,000,000 men. Well, first of all, that number is suspiciously round. I mean, it might have been 997,326. But probably the number is way too big. Probably the number is way too big. But even an army of 300,000 men. Stop and think now, in a modern society, of the cost and all of the administrative problems that would be associated with maintaining 300,000 men. War may strike us as something unpleasant, as something unthinkable even, but war is one of the most sophisticated things any society can do. And maintaining a military establishment is one of the most complicated things that any society can do. In some very real ways, to peer into a society and figure out how it works, ask questions about its military establishment, and you'll learn a very great deal about that society. So the Persians had a very large army, which at least in antiquity was imagined to be as large as 300,000 men. There was also inside that army a quite interesting group, the 10,000 immortals. Now, they weren't immortal in the sense that they didn't die. They were immortal in the sense that if one of them fell in battle, another immediately came up to take his place, so that that central core of the army always stayed at, in tradition, 10,000 men. They also had the responsibility of guarding the Shah, of guarding the emperor, guarding the king, of protecting him. And indeed, Persian rulers did not fall on the battlefield, but they did appear on the battlefield. They didn't sort of sit way far away and watch what was going on. So a very large army, one thing. The second place, brilliant cavalry tactics. The Persians, as I mentioned a moment ago in connection with the Assyrians, who understood how to use cavalry to get someplace fast, it was the Persians who figured out what to do with men on horses once you got there. Now, on any given battlefield, the challenge for those fighting is either to outflank the enemy or to avoid being outflanked by the enemy. Two long, relatively stable lines slugging it out with each other will create a lot of mayhem and destruction, and at the end of the day, think of the trench warfare in World War I, you may have moved forward a few yards or fallen back a few yards, but not much will have changed. What the Persians discovered is that once the main bodies of infantry had engaged, if you used cavalry at just the right moment, in just the right numbers, you could turn your enemy's flank. And this then would produce the rout. This then produces an enemy who is not surrounded, but who's being attacked on two sides simultaneously. So in that sense, some aspects of military strategy from antiquity persist right down to modern times. Now, there were other reasons for Persian success too. I don't want to put all of the stress on the Persian military establishment. The Persians were very tolerant of the customs of local peoples. They often left local people in charge. Now, the basic local officer of the Persian administration was called a satrap. The Persians built a very sophisticated and complicated administrative structure. It all culminated in the Shah, it culminated in the emperor, and then there were these officials at the local level called satraps. Now, under the satraps, there were various minor and subordinate officials, and then interestingly enough, above the satraps, there were officials called the eyes and ears of the king. They were, in effect, state spies, and they were sent out to kind of observe. But you didn't know who they were. You didn't know when they were coming. You didn't know when they would leave. You didn't even know quite what message they'd been given, what they were supposed to go discover about the peoples, you see, on whom they were spying. But in any case, this was a very effective way of making sure that people at the local level were behaving themselves. Now, mentioning these satraps and mentioning the fact that the Persians sometimes, not always, but sometimes left local people in charge, raises another interesting point, something that will recur again and again and again in future lectures, and it may be worth pausing just for a minute to put a little bit of focus on it right now. If you're going to create a large administrative structure, if you want to build an empire, if you want to build a kingdom, if you want to build a state, you're going to have help at the local level. Now, in building a state and in securing help at the local level, you have basically two choices. You can use your own people and send them out. At this stage, they have no connection to the local societies where they're working. They're not married into those societies. They didn't grow up there. They don't own property there. They have no local loyalties. They have no local interests. They're not going to sort of be sympathetic necessarily to the locals. They will be entirely loyal to the central administration, which has appointed them and sent them out. That's one theory. Generally speaking, it's reasonably effective, at least in some cases. The other theory is that what it is best to do, what it is wisest to do, most prudent to do, is raise up prominent local people, precisely because they are anchored in the local society. They are married in that society. They own property in that society. They know the customs of that society. They know everybody's secrets. They know what's going on. And all of that local knowledge can be turned to your benefit. How? Well, if you're very clever, and the Persians were very clever at this, and we'll see in later lectures that the Romans were absolute masters at this, if you pick out people of some local prominence, of some local authority, of some local respect, and you elevate them very far beyond what they could ever have hoped to achieve at the local level on their own, they don't now all of a sudden change their stripes. They're not any longer not local people who know the local scene, but they're completely loyal to you because you can take away all that you gave them. And if you take away all that you gave them and reduce them to mere locals again after they've had power over the locals, things may not go so very well to them. So there is simultaneously a kind of a loyalty at the local level and to the central level. Well, the Persians, clever folk that they were, used both of these systems. Later on, we'll see the Romans blending both of these systems. We'll see rulers in medieval Europe using both of these systems. But always these are the two basic choices. I send my guys out there, or I find and promote people who are already out there. So, as I said, the Persians didn't go one way or the other. They blended the two systems. Now, the Persian success is attributable also to a number of other important developments. For instance, they created a very common system of weights and measures throughout this enormous empire. Now, I mean, any of us who travel, we go off on holiday to Europe, and all of a sudden everything's in kilos and things, and we, oops, how much is that? Now we have the new euro coinage in Europe, so we don't have to try to figure out how many lira make a dollar and all of those wonderfully complicated things that we used to have to figure out. But let's suppose, for example, you were traveling around the United States, and one state used the system of ounces and pound, and another state used grams and kilograms. Well, it would be rather confusing, wouldn't it? It would be hard to trade, and how would you buy products? And, you know, if your breakfast cereal is made in a factory someplace, well, do they have to make two different boxes, one in kilos and one in pounds? Well, the point is that the example is not absurd. It would be very, very complicated. What if, for example, we had different money in our 50 states? And every time you crossed the state line, you would sort of change your money and reorganize yourself and rethink how to do things at the local level. Well, what the Persians did is create a not absolutely 100% unified, but a very substantially unified system of weights and measures throughout this vast empire, which facilitated trade in crucial ways. They created a single coinage throughout this vast empire, which again facilitated trade, facilitated travel, facilitated the building and the maintaining of an effective state. They built roads. The Great Royal Road ran from the Persian capital city of Persepolis right up to the Mediterranean coast of Anatolia, right up to actually where those Greeks lived, with whom the Persians got themselves mixed up, as we'll see in a later lecture. Well, building roads facilitated travel. Now, it's perfectly true, in point of fact, that the Persians didn't build their roads because they were just benevolent and thought this was a good idea. They built these great roads because you could move armies long distances fast. Precisely why the Romans, for example, built their great road system. The Romans didn't build those roads so that later on people would admire them. They built those roads in order to move troops in a big hurry. But in any case, other benefits flowed from the creation of the Persian road system. There's no question about that. The Persians undertook some other smaller gestures, for example, but nevertheless I think important ones. The language of administration through the Persian Empire was Aramaic, not Persian. Now, Aramaic is another Semitic language. Persian is not. The Aramaic is another Semitic language, and it had become, over a very wide area of the Near East, over a long period of time, a kind of lingua, all right? A language that many people spoke. There's an interesting point hiding there. One of the things that we would have to encounter in all of these imperial states we've been talking about, in these successions of empire after empire that we've been talking about, how is communication to be effective? How is communication to be effective? What language is everybody going to speak? Well, communications will have been, over long periods of time, a very complicated matter indeed. The Persians took the step of adopting Aramaic, which was a language that large numbers of people would have known at least a little bit, you see? And therefore communication would have been possible. Just as, for example, later on, Greek, Koine Greek, the common Greek, not the highfalutin Greek of the Attic orators and of Plato and Aristotle, but a common Greek became the language widely used in the Mediterranean world. More widely, actually, than Latin ever was. In the 18th century, French became the language of sort of international communication. Today, obviously, English has become the language of international communication. But in a very real way, and a very long time ago, the Persians had an insight into that process, and so they used the Aramaic language. Now, the Persians built a number of beautiful buildings at their capital at Persepolis, for example, but we think of the Persians particularly when we think of their culture in connection with their religious ideas. Now, the chief manifestation of Persian culture, of Persian religion, was what we call Zoroastrianism. Now, this is a rather complicated matter, once again, as with Abraham, as with some of the other religious figures that we'll talk about this term. Scholars dispute the date for Zarathustra, the great teacher of what we call Zoroastrianism. Sometimes you'll hear him referred to as Zoroaster, sometimes Zarathustra, same person. Some would say he goes back perhaps as far as 1000 BC. Others would say, well, perhaps more like 750. Others would say, well, it's really closer to the time of King Cyrus and the spread of the Persian Empire. In my own view, we probably have something which is actually very old at its origins and then grows and develops and took on new shapes at slightly different points in time. And that as new manifestations of Zoroastrianism appeared, people would tend to attach novelty to them, would attempt to say, this is where the origins are, this is where it all began. And as a result, we get this confused tradition of multiple dates of origin. What we have, as is often the case, is something that is evolving for a long period of time. It's developing over a long period of time. It's really a fool's errand to go and say, that is the moment when it all got started. Now, Zarathustra's teachings are revealed to us in a collection of songs called gathas. Now, the gathas, pardon me, the gathas are poems, basically, but the word apparently does mean song more than poem, so it may very well be the case that they were meant to be sung or perhaps intoned, chanted in some way. Okay? The gathas are preserved in a larger work called the Avesta. Now, these are, in a way, the spiritual scriptures of the Zoroastrians, and therefore of the Persian peoples. If we think about this body of material as a whole, the gathas are a part of the Avesta. The gathas, most scholars think, are the ones, is the section of the Avesta that is particularly to be attributed to Zarathustra himself, you see. And the other parts here are parts of the tradition that has emerged over a longer period of time. What did Zarathustra teach? He taught the idea of a single benevolent God called Ahura Mazda. If you're driving a Mazda automobile, you're driving around in a Zoroastrian car. Now, Zarathustra imagined Ahura Mazda to be the single creator of all. In this, of course, Zarathustra is not wholly unlike the Hebrews. But he is most certainly a henotheist or a monolatrist more than a monotheist. So there is increasingly the idea of focusing on a single deity. Zarathustra was also much intrigued by the problem of evil. Well, how many people over long periods of time have been intrigued by the problem of evil? If there is a single God who has made all things and who is somehow benevolent, why is there evil in the world? Why do bad things happen? Can one supreme being at once have created all that is good and all that opposes it? Well, Zarathustra's answer to this question is a rather interesting one. Zarathustra taught that Ahura Mazda had twin children. And after Ahura Mazda's own time, these two children struggled with one another, and that world history, in a certain sense, is a playing out of this struggle. The one child is wholly benevolent. The other child is wholly evil. Now, if this begins to sound a little like, for example, the tradition of Satan as a figure who is wholly evil and opposed to another figure, God, who is wholly good, there are certain similarities. I think it would be an exaggeration to say borrowings. I think what we see here is people reflecting in comparable ways to similar phenomena. We have this very interesting problem of imagining a benevolent God and then looking at the world around us. Now, this perpetual struggle between the forces of good and the forces of evil produces a rather interesting way of thinking about the world. And we call this dualism. Now, we meet this dualism for the first time here with the Zoroastrians. We'll meet it later again and again and again. It basically involves us in a series of polarities, good and evil. Sometimes it puts us in a realm of poetic images, light and dark. Sometimes it puts us in a series of emotional images, hope and fear. Sometimes it puts us into a series of spiritual and psychological images, flesh and spirit. St. Paul says the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Well, St. Paul was not a Zoroastrian, but there were certain common ways of talking, certain common ways of thinking. Imagining these polarities as a way that each of us lives our lives, as we face the struggles that we go through, imagining the processes that we see around us all the time. This sense of duality. Now, it may just be worth pointing out here that if we reflect back to what I was saying in the previous lecture on the emergence of exclusive monotheism among the Hebrews, and the fact that this produces for Western civilization one powerful but challenging tradition, the notion of thinking in ones, in monads. It's very hard to think in ones, very hard indeed. It's much easier to think in twos, perhaps easier still to think in manys, polys, polytheists, many gods. But at the very least, two seems somehow a superior way of imagining the world, at least for some, than to think in terms of strict unities. Now, Zoroaster himself, Zarathustra, was very much more interested in the spiritual realm than in the earthly, in the temporal, in what we see around us. This again will be a very powerful part of later philosophical and religious traditions. All right? We'll see this, for example, particularly in connection with Plato. But there is this insight, and we find it in Zarathustra, and I don't want to suggest later, for example, that Plato was somehow a closet Zoroastrian. That's not the point. But people are arriving at fairly common understandings of problems. The world as I see it, as I look out at it, is messy and confusing and troubling and complicated. Surely there is a world beyond this one that is better, that is clearer, that is more easy to understand. And perhaps this world is somehow but a false impression of that other realm. You see? Very interesting to think of the superiority of the spiritual realm to the temporal realm in which we live. But these dualisms, I must emphasize once more, are going to come back again and again and again. We're going to meet them with people called Manichaeans in the time of the Roman Empire. We're going to meet them as people called Bogomils. You probably haven't been thinking much about Bogomils lately, but 20 or so lectures on, I'll invite you to think about Bogomils. We're going to meet them as Cathars. We're going to meet them as people in the south of France called Albigensians. So these dualists who trace a direct legacy to Zoroaster are an impressive and important part of the Western tradition. So what's the legacy of this imperial age? Well, the Assyrians and the Babylonians built some impressive buildings, but didn't otherwise leave much else behind. They were not the kind of people who were going to leave much behind. As I said before, these were bad guys. The Persians, on the other hand, left a legacy of civilized rule. They left a particular way of thinking about government and about kingship, and they left a profound religious heritage that interacted reciprocally and fruitfully with Judaism, with Christianity, and later with Islam. Well, I mentioned several times that the Persians bumped into the Greeks. In our very next lecture, we ourselves will bump into the Greeks.